Hello everyone, sorry I can't be with you in person. This is the first section looking at the trial. It's probably best if you flick back and actually listen to the introduction that I put up for you on modernism. This is a modernist text drawn from Kafka's The Trial, and the film itself has a lot of sort of modernist themes that run through it. So, principal amongst these, I think, is this sense of existential angst, the sense of fragmentation, the idea that as an individual, the system is utterly out to get you and sort of grind you down. So some of the ideas that we're going to look at now are introducing some of the other handouts that are available for you on Blackboard. So we're going to talk a little bit more about Foucault, and I've also found a decent picture actually of a panopticon, so it'll give you a better idea of actually what the experience of one of those structures is. So the text itself deals with totalitarianism, so the individual very much against the kind of the state, and we can position this alongside other texts. And if you're interested, there's a couple of exercises that you can do yourself, opening up the trial by comparison with 1984, which I think is very kind of useful. So Kafka, as a writer, spawned the term, well, he didn't spawn it about himself, but people talking about his work talk about the Kafkaesque, a set of tropes, a set of themes and ideas that percolate through his work that we see sort of time and time again. So we have sometimes what we might think of as being sort of surreal situations. Now, if I were you, I would go online and have a little look at some surrealist artists, look at somebody like Magritte and see the way in which he's using the commonplace, such as the man with the bowler hat, and actually replacing his face with an apple. So some very interesting ideas that kind of shake us out of the mundane, but are still very much focused in on the individual, focused in on the sort of community of working class individuals in particular. So other elements of Kafka's writing include a kind of a dream-like environment that very often sort of gives way to a nightmare-like grip, a vice grip upon the individual as well. And there's a theme throughout his work as well of the absurd. So if you're familiar with absurdist theatre, if you're perhaps familiar with Samuel Beckett's work in particular, you can see, I think, elements of this here in the trial. And Orson Welles, in the TV interview that I've downloaded and left for you on Blackboard, talks about the trial as being the finest film. So this is a film that he's very proud of as a director, and perhaps as well as an actor. So a little bit of background then on Kafka. If you've ever been to Prague, you'll be familiar with brand new, beautiful museum given over to Kafka just on the banks of the river there. So Kafka didn't necessarily sort of start off thinking I'm going to be a writer. He actually was a student of the law, so you can see, I think, these elements within his work, particularly the kind of the law system here within the trial. Only managed to write 7 works in his lifetime, but had manuscripts for other pieces, and you can see there that the executor of his will actually went ahead and published those, which was quite interesting because there's a similar sort of dynamic going on there in comparison with George Orwell and 1984. Unfortunately, Kafka was never a well man, so early on in his life he contracted tuberculosis, which finally sort of killed him off. So rather an unpleasant end for him, and an unpleasant existence as well, being racked by that particular disease. So a little bit more detail here about the type of work he engaged with. Very much focused, as I say, on the mundane, on the everyday, but with this strain running through of humour and surrealism as well. Focuses in on the play or the complexities of language, and you'll see from the reader the extract from the trial, you can see that kind of interest in language, kind of very overly long sentences actually, and have a look and see about the way in which there is a kind of a sense of play within his writing there, or even the futile for the reader who's actually trapped as well, like the characters within these kind of labyrinths of language. The myth that this brings to mind to me is the myth of Sisyphus. So if you're aware of Sisyphus, he's the chap in Hades who's kind of pushing the rock up to the top of the hill, and then it kind of rolls back down again. He has to kind of roll it up. So, think about Citizen K, that runs through the whole of this text. Think about repeatedly the kind of the absurd situation he kind of finds himself in, and for me, I think it has parallels with that particular Greek character from Greek myth. So I think it's worth comparing as well, like I say, with sort of 1984. So I've put alongside the trial Michael Radford's adaptation of 1984, starring John Hurt. It's a very powerful text. Orwell himself was dying of consumption, as he was finalising 1984, and actually was very unhappy with the final draft. And there's some evidence to suggest that he actually didn't want 1984 published in its current form, which I think is very interesting when you think about how important 1984 is to our experience of 20th century literature. Really, you'll have all come across it. It's an important text in that sense. So Orwell, talking about his text, was quite keen not to use the book as an attack on socialism, which some people were kind of reading it as, but he was thinking about totalitarianism in its various forms. So you recall that Orwell experienced firsthand this kind of rise of totalitarianism in the 1930s, in particular, and then onwards into the Second World War, whereas Kafka's early death, a lot of his work is far more prophetic, so he's having to think forward about what might happen rather than what is. So as well as Kafka's viewpoint being a prophetic one about what's going to come, this kind of prophet of fascism and the sort of heavy bureaucracy of the state crushing the individual, you've also got Orson Welles, who as a director is drawing on what he knows and the influences he knows of totalitarianism and also the Second World War. So this is coming later, obviously, in the 20th century by the time the film's made. So you can see that there are certain elements within the text that are quite suggestive, I think, of a Cold War narrative, such as the apartment blocks or even the final explosion at the end. So if we just take a look at some of those images, you can see here sort of strange, possibly hanging hooks or meat hooks sort of behind him, possibly a kind of sense of the gallows there as well. These are kind of the apartment blocks I was talking about, and the kind of the no man's land that you have, this destruction and dereliction there, and here the kind of the final explosion too. So you can see that Welles is although he's kind of being faithful, or mostly faithful to the original text, he is still augmenting that with topics and themes that are relevant to the viewer that happened since Kafka had published his novel. Now would be a useful time to have a look at some of the seminar notes surrounding the trial. The term angst is one that is overused in our society, normally to mean kind of a stroppy teenager, but actually the term angst, the German word, is full of these kind of unresolvable anxiety. So if you think of Edvard Munch's The Scream, that to me is this kind of embodiment of angst. So the term has a kind of a deeper meaning in this kind of context. In the origins of totalitarianism, we see definitions of kind of totalitarianism as being distinct from dictatorship or the kind of the one-party state. So, theorising the term, certainly Stalin and Hitler's organisation of their countries kind of fit into that, and possibly as well now, sort of North Korea. So you have this kind of focus towards sort of global domination, and destruction, that actually victory in itself may result in large swathes of population actually being destroyed, so genocide is being practiced, and that in doing so we are actually undermining what it means to be human. So Zizek, a more recent critic, has kind of returned some of these ideas of totalitarianism. So if you're thinking about a particular sort of totalitarian state within your adaptation, I think you need to define what you mean by totalitarianism, and if you could problematise it, I think that would be very, very useful. But I think there's been a tendency to be concerned about totalitarianism because you have a number of academics, left-wing academics, uncomfortable about the attack on socialism, perhaps. So it's quite interesting then, the ways in which this kind of idea of totalitarianism has not been threatened perhaps by some of these kind of left-wing academics. So Zizek would be an interesting person to kind of explore there in responses to the term. So what I'd like you to do now is to read the chapter of the trial that exists in your reader, and to look through for the kind of the different themes, the extent to which you can see within the film itself, some of these additional areas. So the bullet points there really are kind of referring to both the film and the and the text that you have there in the reader. So spend some time doing that. It's going to take quite a time. That's probably a half an hour to 45-minute exercise. So if you're not interested in these themes, that might be a moment to pause there and go on to the next recording.